Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Miller, and I'm the US Country Manager for Whizz Education. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, Dr. Junaid Mubin. Junaid is Whizz's Director of Education, and he'll be participating in the dialogue from London in the United Kingdom. Thanks for making the time today, Junaid.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, Paul.
So Whizz Education is a global education partner accountable for learning outcomes. We operate on 6 different continents, and we work with governments, school districts, individual schools, and local and international stakeholders to understand and address the challenges that exist in achieving an inclusive and quality education for all. As a mission-driven organization, we operate on the core belief that every child deserves a learning experience that caters to their individual needs and pace of learning, and that localized solutions designed in partnership with education stakeholders, such as all of you, are essential to overcoming barriers and delivering improved learning outcomes. Now, our conversation here today is about how to think about and how to address COVID-19 learning loss. And this is a topic, of course, which is very current among educators and policymakers, but it can also be quite daunting, in particular because of the cascading headlines suggesting the dire impacts of the disruptions that have taken place over the past year. As recently as this week, the United Nations, came out with a statement indicating that we may be facing a catastrophic education emergency if further action is not taken. So I think that's where I'd like to start the dialogue here today. Junaid, as we think about this, how do we process these sort of bold headlines around the magnitude of the challenge? What do we understand about COVID-19 learning loss? Can we make this more manageable? Do we understand what's driving COVID-19 learning loss as a starting point?
Well, we actually do have a pretty clear understanding from past pandemics in particular and the challenges faced there about what drives learning loss whenever you have a period of sustained disruption. And the research that follows other natural disasters and public health emergencies points to 2 drivers of learning loss. Now, the first of these is well known. It's missed instructional time. And it's just manifestly obvious that when students are unable to participate in a standard school day, they lose out on new learning opportunities. But the second factor is slightly less intuitive, and it's the erosion of previously acquired knowledge. So when you remove students from their standard learning environment, they tend to lose further ground because they forget much of that hard-earned prior knowledge. Now, educators are familiar with the phenomenon of the summer slide, which occurs every year. And that's based on the same principle, and it's just amplified during this pandemic. The magnitude of this learning loss, Paul, is just staggering. Globally, on average, school systems were fully closed for 95 days, which when you think about it, is equivalent to slightly more than half a year of lost learning. And the reason that UNICEF has flagged a potential catastrophic education emergency is that 168 million students globally, and overrepresented in Latin America and the Caribbean, have experienced full closure for an entire academic year. And even in developed contexts, such as the US or here in the UK, where school systems have implemented remote or hybrid learning systems, in most cases, they've still been at least partially closed for up to a full calendar year. And again, it's worth saying that this lost instructional time is compounded by the erosion of previously gained knowledge, what we might call the COVID slide, that causes further challenges to students' academic attainment. And while this all paints a very challenging picture, the upshot is that if we can at least understand the dynamics of learning loss as it relates to pandemics, then we can begin to move beyond these breathless headlines and discuss how to address those challenges.
So a number of different models have been put forward to quantify the total amount of learning loss. What do we know about the strength of these models?
So at the moment, there are a number of high-profile teams of researchers who have modeled the possible outcomes of learning loss as a result of COVID-19. Now, these models have been published by teams of expert researchers in multinational organizations, universities, and the private sector. So incredibly diverse perspectives. And some of the most commonly cited models that you'll find have been published by the World Bank, McKinsey and Company, the Credo team based out of Stanford University. And these models, and sometimes they're based on simulations, they analyze extensive high quality data sets to reach their conclusions. So let's just take one example, the World Bank. They've simulated COVID-19 learning loss using data sets covering 157 different countries and 97% of the world's population aged 4 to 17. So very robust data sets. Or let's look at an example from the US. So the model employed by the Center for Research on Education Outcomes, that's Credo, based out of Stanford. They've analyzed student achievement data that's been shared by 30 US states as part of a data sharing consortium. And the results that they've analyzed have generated estimates of learning loss at both a national level as well as providing state level estimates for a number of individual states. Now, here's the interesting thing about the Credo approach. They've developed their model by examining longitudinal student data that goes back 5 full academic years prior to the pandemic. So that would take us all the way back to the 2014-15 academic year. And what they did was they tested several different specifications for simulating actual student outcomes in the 2017-18 school year. So in other words, they were able to validate the robustness and the accuracy of their predictive models by testing it on historical data. And finally, they combined this data with anonymized NWEA data that give us 5 million students from 3rd to 7th grade in approximately 19,000 schools across the US in order to model COVID-related learning loss. Now, in translating these estimates to the intuitive days of learning loss metric, it's important to say that you may lose some precision. The goal of these models, of any model, isn't to give you absolutely precise figures, but to give you a sense of the overall picture, to give you a sense of the orders of magnitude of learning loss. And what we're seeing is that these models that have been derived in different ways are all converging on roughly the same estimates.
So I hear you saying the models are robust and they tend to agree with each other. So what do you anticipate, what do we know from the research, that the average learning loss will be for a K-12 student following the 2020-2021 school year?
Right, so as I said, the estimates do vary, but there is convergence around the scale of learning loss that students have exhibited. Now, before I go into that, let me just say the good news, certainly in the US, I think, is that due to the incredible efforts of educators to rapidly and urgently adapt to their circumstances and to deliver a degree of high quality remote or hybrid instruction, I think the worst case scenarios may well have been averted. But it's worth just touching on those estimates. So if you look at the estimate from McKinsey and Company, their model suggests that students on average will have lost around 5 to 9 months of learning over the course of the school year, with the steepest losses occurring in, you've guessed it, mathematics. And by the way, that's consistent with our own research at Whizz Education. When we analyzed our data sets, they indicate that the magnitude of learning loss experienced by students is in the same ballpark. And when we reviewed our data sets from our work in the US and the UK, what we found was that almost half of students, 46%, entered the fall of the current academic year with significant learning loss. And the findings were really quite staggering. When you look at that subsample of 46% students, they'd exhibited learning loss at an average of 8 months. Their learning was 8 months behind where it was back in March at the initial outset of COVID and when school closures first came in. Staggering losses for almost half of students.
Now, we've been talking a lot about learning loss for the average K-12 student. Are there specific things that we should be considering, specific equity considerations when we think about the different student populations that we serve?
Such an important question, one that's very close to my heart, because the answer unequivocally is yes. Now, let's be clear, all students have faced academic and socio-emotional challenges as a result of COVID and extended school closures. This hasn't been a cakewalk for anyone. But undeniably, there's been a heavier burden that's been borne by underserved communities, particularly ethnic minorities. And in the US, that means Black, Hispanic, Indigenous students have been most impacted. And it's important to say that school systems have made great strides in recent months in providing high-speed internet and internet-enabled devices, but those learning gaps persist nevertheless. And one of the reasons is, Paul, that even when students receive equal access to technology, what you don't always see is equal levels of student engagement because of all of those background factors. And every educator knows that until you address engagement, academic progress is compromised and those gaps can continue to widen. Now, there's other factors too. So in the US context, we know that Black and Hispanic students are likely to have remained in remote learning context longer than their white peers. So all of those things are contributing to persistent gaps among those different demographics.
And that's consistent with research that has recently emerged about even how this current school year began. I mean, this equity lens is so important that, again, as you noted, while there's evidence that all students are losing ground, there's also evidence that beginning in fall of 2020, the gaps were already beginning to widen further for students of color due to COVID-19. Such an important discussion. So given what we've discussed so far, how do we begin to respond to this truly urgent challenge?
Well, it's important to say that the purpose of any model is to drive action. And if there's one thing to take away from these learning loss models, it's the risks and the costs of inaction. And so what those simulations, those various models of COVID-19 itself have shown us, the models that we're exposed to every day in the press, is that we can expect very different outcomes depending on the actions that we take and the timeliness with which we take them. It is possible to mitigate the threats of COVID if we respond accordingly. So those models do not present definite realities. They just represent possible futures that we can change if we take appropriate action. Well, the same is true for learning loss. What we're seeing here on this slide is a projection from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. And what it shows is that those systems that are very proactive in implementing intervention strategies as early as this year can expect to recover academic attainment and have them return to pre-pandemic levels within 3 to 4 years. But if you look at those systems that fail to make those investments and do not dedicate themselves to catch-up programs, then that recovery will be twice as long. So that's the stark difference between the two. We know that all students have been affected, as we said, some more than others. Many students have lost ground this past year, but we do still have opportunities to mitigate against the worst threats of learning loss and particularly to mitigate against further losses. And we can, if we take action now, we can absolutely accelerate our recovery efforts.
So tell me a bit more about what some key components of that type of accelerated learning may be.
So it's important to acknowledge that any response, any intervention strategy has to be holistic. I don't believe there are any silver bullets. I don't know of any. And that's largely because the specific impacts of COVID, they're so unique to the individual, aren't they? Everybody has experienced COVID-19 in their own way. And when we talk about learning losses, of course, we have to start with high-level analysis, but ultimately we need to deliver our response in a way that is sensitive to the needs and realities of individual communities, individual schools, all the way down to individual students. And so any data that we use should inform our actions, and it should really have a certain degree of granularity to it. So just to cite the example of the work that we do at Whizz Education, the data that we share with the schools that partner with us, it's not premised on overall averages. It's premised on very detailed insights into the knowledge gaps that exist and the learning losses that have occurred within their specific communities, all the way down to individual learners. And the aim is to then develop response strategies at the level of individual learners to support and empower teachers to develop strategies that are aligned to the challenges of their classroom. There are some very definite truths in all of this. We just know that if we don't act now, further losses will be incurred and we risk losing a generation of students. But there's also a historic opportunity. I think we are at an inflection point, and it's all about our outlook. We have to get through this pandemic, and assuredly we will. But I think much will depend on how we get through the pandemic. We can't simply apply a band-aid, because these threats will continue to emerge in the future. And I think now is an opportunity to just take pause and ask, how can we address learning loss and the threats that the pandemic poses? How can we address them in such a way that actually builds resilience in our system and prepares us for future shocks? And how can we set students up, not just to recover their learning losses and to get back on track, but to actually prepare them and set them on a trajectory for long-term success in school and in life? That, I think, is the most profound question that we can all be asking as educators.
Well, I think that's a great way to round out our dialogue here today. So it strikes me that there's some key conclusions that you've steered us towards here in our conversation today, Junaid. One, just understanding that the magnitude of the challenge is real, and that it does require, as a result, a coherent and sustained approach to accelerating student outcomes. And critically, that approach should align with educators' local context. There's no one-size-fits-all or silver bullet solution, as you mentioned earlier. The second is to note that equity must remain paramount. While all students have lost ground, there's a particularly acute need to support vulnerable students, students from historically marginalized communities. A third point is that the evidence behind learning loss is robust. We can rely on these models to some extent. They're well grounded empirically, and they should remain the focus of our strategic attention as an education community. And finally, I think it's quite clear that absent dedicated efforts at accelerated learning, recovery time for students and communities could take as much as twice as long. And I think that's a key point. That there's not just an urgency around the impact of these losses, but there's a time sensitivity as well about making sure that we're able to put students, families, communities on a path back to recovery. So, Junaid, thank you for walking us through all of that research and helping us take this large phenomenon of COVID-19 learning loss and making it more manageable. Again, for those joining us, we're Whizz Education. We are an education partner accountable for learning outcomes. We provide a variety of different services, everything from program design to teacher training and professional development, to we do deploy intelligent teaching and learning solutions, such as our Maths-Whizz virtual tutoring platform. And for those who are interested in that particular service, we can be part of your solution to accelerating learning outcomes for students. Students using our virtual tutoring services in English and Spanish on average gain over 18 months in their first year of use. So thank you, everybody. And please reach out to us. Let's connect. And we'd love to hear about your specific needs and how we might partner with you to tackle this generational challenge. Thank you very much, everyone.